The desert remembers those who walk it with truth in their hearts. Long after the wind has erased the footprints and the sun has swallowed the horizon, the stories of the righteous remain, carried quietly in the dunes, whispered through the acacia trees, and guarded by the stillness of the night. Among those stories stands the life of Omar Al-Mukhtar, a boy once cradled by the sands of Cyrenaica, who grew to become one of its wisest sons and the unshakable shepherd of its people. He was born in 1862 near the small village of Zawiat Janzur in eastern Libya, where the green hills of Cyrenaica lean gently toward the great stretches of desert. The village was modest: whitewashed houses, tents of woven goat hair, a small zawiya where the Sanusi order taught faith and discipline, and fields that depended on the mercy of the rain. The air carried the scent of earth after rare downpours, of burning wood, of camel sweat and wild thyme crushed beneath passing hooves. His father, Mukhtar bin Omar, was a respected member of the Minifa tribe, a man whose words were few, but always carefully chosen. People said he had the kind of face that made others trust him before he spoke. Steady eyes, a calm brow, a voice that never needed to be raised to be heard. His mother was gentle and perceptive, a woman of prayer whose hands were always in motion, kneading dough, mending clothes, offering comfort with a touch to the shoulder. Their tent was not rich with possessions, but it was rich with something far more precious, a sense of peace, of order, of faith that anchored every day. Into this world, Omar opened his eyes. As a child, he listened more than he spoke. When other children shouted and chased one another across the sand, he often stood off to the side, watching, as though he were trying to understand the pattern of everything. The way dust rose in tiny spirals behind running feet, the way shadows stretched long before sunset, the way adults lowered their voices when they spoke of serious things. His mother sometimes placed a hand on his head and smiled, sensing in him a quiet depth. His earliest memories were filled with the textures of the land. He remembered the softness of sand slipping through his fingers, bright grains sparkling like tiny stars under the sun. He remembered the distant silhouettes of camels crossing the horizon, tall and unhurried, as if time itself walked with them. He remembered waking before dawn to the sound of roosters and the rustle of people preparing for prayer. The sky above his village, deep blue, slowly lightening at the edges. But more than anything, he remembered voices. Voices of elders telling stories of ancestors who kept their word even when it cost them dearly. Of men who protected guests at all costs. Of women whose patience healed broken hearts. These stories wrapped around his childhood like a cloak. The Zawiya in Janzur soon became the center of his world. It was a simple building, its white walls touched by the hands of many generations, its courtyard often filled with the low murmur of reciting students. Here, he began to study the Quran. He traced each letter slowly with his finger, lips moving silently at first, then aloud. The verses were more than sounds to him. They were currents that flowed through his heart, shaping his understanding of right and wrong, of justice, of mercy. He felt, even as a young boy, that the words were not merely to be memorized, but to be lived. His teachers quickly noticed something unusual in him. He was not the fastest student, nor the loudest, nor the one who rushed to answer every question. But he absorbed knowledge deeply. When others forgot a lesson after a few days, he remembered it weeks later, not only with his mind, but with his actions. When the teacher spoke about honesty, Omar returned a lost coin to its owner. When they discussed patience, he stayed behind to help clean the courtyard without being asked. Once, an elder of the Zawaya said to another, "This boy will carry knowledge in his bones." Life in Cyrenaica was harsh but ordered. The land taught its own lessons. As a child, Omar walked with his father across stony hills and through shallow valleys dotted with scrub. He learned to recognize the tracks of foxes and gazelles, the distant shimmer that meant a water source, the change in the wind that signaled an approaching storm. He tended goats and camels, guiding them to sparse pastures, standing for long hours under the sun or the cold blue sky of winter. In those quiet stretches of time, the line between the world outside and the world within grew thin. The desert became his silent teacher. Sometimes his father would break the silence to speak in a low voice about responsibility. "A man," he would say, "is not measured by how much he owns, but by what he protects. These animals, this land, our family, our guests, each is a trust placed in our hands." The words sank into young Omar's heart. He began to understand that leadership was not about commanding others. It was about carrying burdens without letting them fall, about standing firm when others needed someone to lean on. When he was still young, the rhythms of his life were shaken by loss. His father passed away, leaving him and his family under the weight of grief and uncertainty. For a boy who had always known his father as a solid presence, the absence felt like a sudden, permanent silence. But even in this sorrow, the teachings of the Zawiya and the strength of his mother steadied him. She spoke to him of trust in God, of resilience, of continuing the path of goodness. He watched her endure with dignity and courage, and he resolved in his heart to honor her sacrifices with his own steadfastness. As he entered adolescence, a new door opened before him. The Sanusi order, recognizing his potential, chose him to continue his studies in Jakbab, an important religious and educational center in the Libyan desert. The journey there was long. He traveled with caravans, sleeping under domes of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, listening to men recite poetry and prayers as camels groaned softly in the night. Along the way, he heard news of the wider world, of empires and distant wars, of changing rulers, of the slow tightening of foreign ambitions around North Africa. The horizon of his awareness expanded, but so did his sense of responsibility. Jakbab was unlike his small village. It buzzed with scholars, seekers, travelers from different tribes and regions. The Zawaya there were alive with debate and reflection. Every corner seemed to hold a book, a teacher, a conversation about law or theology or history. Omar walked its dusty paths with eyes wide and heart open. He studied Islamic jurisprudence, Arabic language, prophetic traditions, and the stories of past peoples who stood against tyranny. The more he learned, the more he understood that knowledge without action was incomplete. He came under the guidance of Sanusi sheikhs who embodied discipline and humility. They rose in the quiet before dawn, prayed with long, measured recitations, worked with their hands alongside students, and lived simply despite their status. Their example left a mark on him deeper than any written text. He learned that a true scholar is first a servant of God, of truth, of people. Leadership, he saw, was a burden that only rested safely on the shoulders of those who didn't crave it. During these years, his character solidified. He became known among his peers for his calm temperament and balanced judgment. When disagreements arose between students, they often turned to him to mediate. He listened to each side with patience, speaking slowly, weighing his words, seeking fairness rather than victory. Even when he disagreed, he did so with respect. It was said that arguing with him felt less like a battle and more like sitting in the shade of a tree and being gently guided toward clarity. But the years in Jagbab did more than refine his mind. They broadened his sense of the world's pain. Travelers brought news of colonization creeping across Africa, of lands taken, languages suppressed, customs mocked, and economies twisted by foreign control. These stories troubled him deeply. He did not rant or rage, but he carried a quiet anger, an anger not of hatred, but of moral outrage at injustice. He began to think about what might one day be required of him, of his people, of anyone who wished to live with dignity. When his time of study came to an end, he did not seek a position of comfort in a great center of learning. Instead, he returned to the hills and valleys of Cyrenaica, to the same kind of villages where he had grown up, where people struggled daily against drought, poverty, and isolation. He became a teacher and a Sanusi sheikh, first in small communities like Kusbat, and then across broader regions. His days filled with simple but noble tasks, leading prayers, teaching children to recite and understand the Quran, settling disputes over land and livestock, comforting the bereaved, encouraging the young. He walked from house to house, often on foot or on the back of a modest horse, never arriving with entourage or show. His clothes were those of an ordinary man, his belongings few. People loved him because he did not stand above them. He stood among them. When a drought threatened crops, he stood in the open with them, hands raised in supplication. When a child fell ill, he visited the family, offering both prayers and whatever practical help he could. When tensions rose between tribes, he rode to the affected area, sometimes placing himself physically between angry men, urging them to remember God, honor, and the fragility of life. In evenings, after the final prayer of the day, children would gather around him in the courtyard of the Zawiya or beneath the shade of acacia trees. He told them stories, not only of warriors and battles, but of the patience of the prophets, the generosity of the righteous, the justice of wise leaders. He wanted them to understand that true greatness was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, consistent, and rooted in moral principles. During these years, the land around him didn't yet roar with war, but the distant rumble of change grew louder. In 1911, the Italian invasion of Libya began. News spread that foreign ships had appeared off the coast, that Tripoli and other cities were under attack, that the old order was shuddering. At first, the impact in the rural interior was slow, like the gradual darkening of the sky before a storm. But the people of Cyrenaica understood what such an invasion meant. They had seen what colonization had done in neighboring lands. They knew that once foreign powers seized control, they would not easily release it. Omar Al-Mukhtar did not leap immediately into arms. His nature was not impulsive. He watched, listened, and reflected deeply. He sought guidance in prayer. He met with other Sanusi leaders and tribal elders, weighing the choices before them. Could negotiation secure their rights? Would resistance bring ruin upon the villages? Could they stand aside while others took their land, dictated their laws, and humiliated their people? Over time, as the Italian presence grew more aggressive and uncompromising, the answer became painfully clear. Neutrality would be surrender by another name. He did not become a warrior because he loved fighting. He became one because his conscience left him no road that avoided sacrifice. In his heart, he believed that every person is accountable before God for how they respond to injustice. To accept humiliation when one has the means to resist is, in his view, a kind of betrayal of the land, of the ancestors, of the future generations yet unborn. And so, reluctantly but firmly, he stepped into a new role. Drawing on his deep knowledge of Cyrenaica's terrain, tribes, and social fabric, Omar began to organize resistance. It started small, groups of men, lightly armed, who knew the hills and valleys like the backs of their hands. They traveled by night, blending with the land by day, striking where the Italian forces were vulnerable and avoiding direct confrontation where their enemies held overwhelming advantage. These were not reckless raids. They were carefully planned operations, guided by his strategic mind and moral compass. From the beginning, he laid down clear rules. Civilians were not to be harmed. Prisoners were not to be abused. Property was not to be looted. Their struggle, he insisted, must be clean in intention and method. "We are not thieves," he reminded his men. "We are protectors. If we act like oppressors, we have already lost, no matter what the outcome on the field." His fighters listened, not because he shouted at them, but because they knew his life reflected the values he preached. Years passed, and the resistance did not vanish. Instead, it grew in strength and skill. Omar's reputation spread across the desert. Stories circulated of his sudden appearances on distant ridges, his ability to move between camps quickly, his way of anticipating enemy movements as if he could read the terrain like a map etched in his heart. Italian forces, though better equipped with artillery and aircraft, struggled to pin down this elusive leader and the fighters who followed him with such devotion. Yet amid the harshness of conflict, he never ceased to be a teacher. Between battles, he returned to villages to lead prayers, reassure families, and remind people that their struggle was not only about land, but about the right to live with honor. He taught his fighters to maintain their rituals of worship, to treat one another as brothers, to care for the wounded and share scarce supplies. Many of the young men who joined him had grown up hearing his lessons. To them, he was not only a military leader, but almost a father figure, a man whose approval they sought not from fear, but from love. There were battles that ended in their favor, where Italian convoys were ambushed, supply lines disrupted, and outposts overrun. In such moments, the fighters felt the rush of triumph, but Omar always tempered celebration with sobriety. "Do not let victory deceive you," he would say. "This path is long. Our worth is not measured by a single day." He seemed to live in a constant state of balance, never fully elated by success, never broken by setback. And there were setbacks. The enemy adapted, bringing more troops, more weapons, more brutal tactics. Villages suspected of aiding the resistance were punished. New fortifications were built. Airplanes roared overhead, dropping bombs in places that had once known only the wind and the cry of birds. The Italians introduced policies designed to starve the rebellion of support, forcing people from their lands into camps where disease and hunger stalked them. The suffering of his people weighed heavily on Omar's heart. In the stillness of night, when fires burned low and others slept, he often remained awake, sitting alone beneath the stars, quietly speaking to his Lord. In those solitary conversations with God, he poured out his fears and hopes. He asked for strength to continue, for patience to endure, for protection for his people. He never pretended to be fearless. Courage for him was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite it. Day after day, year after year, he chose that path. As he grew older, the signs of age appeared. White in his beard, lines deepening in his face, a stiffness in his movements when he rose after long rides. Yet he refused to retire to safety. When younger men suggested he should move to a secure place and guide them from afar, he replied gently, "How can I ask you to face danger while I remain behind? A shepherd doesn't abandon the flock because wolves have appeared. That is when he must be closest to them. His presence on the battlefield had a power beyond tactics. To see him ride at the front, calm and composed, strengthened the hearts of those around him. They whispered to one another, "As long as he stands, we cannot collapse." To the Italians, it became clear that defeating scattered fighters was not enough. As long as Omar lived, the spirit of resistance would continue to rise. By 1931, after nearly 2 decades of struggle, the strain on the region had become immense. Drought and forced relocations had weakened many tribes. The Italian command, determined to crush the resistance decisively, tightened its grip, surrounding the areas where Omar and his men operated. The desert that had long sheltered him grew more dangerous, watched by patrols and aircraft. In September of that year, fate turned sharply. While moving with a small group through a valley near Slonta, his horse stumbled as they came under enemy fire. His companions were killed or scattered, and he was captured. The news raced through Cyrenaica like a cold wind. In tents and houses, people fell into stunned silence. Mothers clutched their children. Old men stared at the ground, eyes glistening. It felt as if a mountain had been seized. Even some among the Italian officers were struck by the moment. Here stood the man they had hunted for so long, the symbol of Libyan resistance, now in chains. But the prisoner before them didn't look like a defeated criminal. He looked like an elder whose dignity remained intact. His clothes were simple, his beard white, his back straight despite his age. When they questioned him, he answered clearly, without flattery or fear. He admitted nothing shameful, because there was nothing in his actions he considered shameful. He had defended his land. For him, that was enough. He was taken to Benghazi for trial, a proceeding meant to be swift and show the power of the colonizers. The courtroom was crowded, Italian officials, soldiers, a few carefully chosen local spectators. Omar entered walking on his own feet. Those who saw him later recalled that his face was serene, as if he were a man who had already made peace with whatever awaited him. The trial was framed as a legal formality, but everyone understood its true nature. He was accused of leading armed resistance, of refusing to submit to Italian rule. When asked if he had done these things, he did not respond with apologies or excuses. He spoke simply of his people's right to defend their homeland, of his own sense of duty. The judges offered the possibility of leniency if he would publicly call on his followers to surrender. But he would not trade his principles for his life. "I cannot betray what I have taught them," he said in essence. To renounce resistance, after so many years of sacrifice, would have been to break the trust that bound him to his people. When the sentence of death was pronounced, he didn't protest. He had long known that this path might end at the gallows. For him, death in this cause was not a tragedy, but the natural closing of a chapter he had written with faith and perseverance. Outside the court, word spread quickly. People wept openly. Some prayed that God might yet deliver him. Others understood that even if his body was taken, his story would never belong to his captors. The day of his execution arrived, heavy and still. In the early morning, he was led from his cell. Guards who had watched him during his imprisonment later spoke of him with an uneasy respect. They had seen him pray with deep concentration, had heard his calm words, had witnessed how he carried himself with quiet dignity. He did not curse them. He did not beg. He remained a man at peace with his conscience. He was taken to the area of Suluk, where a large number of local people had been forced to gather, compelled to watch as a warning. Yet the Italians did not understand that what they hoped would be a spectacle of fear would become Instead, a moment of enduring inspiration. As Omar Al-Mukhtar approached the gallows, some in the crowd cried, some raised their hands in supplication, some bowed their heads in grief and pride. He walked with steady steps, head held high, as though walking toward a familiar door. At 73 years of age, he left this world. But in that moment, something remarkable happened in the hearts of his people. The colonizers had taken his life, but in doing so, they lit the flame of his legend. His death did not mark the defeat of his cause. It fixed his example in memory as something unblemished, beyond the reach of further injury. In the nights that followed, under the canvas of tents and the cracked roofs of houses, his story was told and retold. Fathers spoke of him to sons. Mothers whispered his name to daughters drifting into sleep. Poets shaped verses around his courage, his humility, his unwavering faith. The children who grew up after him didn't know his voice, but they knew his character, as if they had sat with him beneath the acacia trees of Janzur. As the years flowed forward, the land of Libya changed hands, systems, and flags. But through each transformation, the memory of Omar Al-Mukhtar remained, like a rooted tree that survives storms. He was remembered not only as a fighter, but as a teacher, a leader, a man whose inner compass never spun in confusion. People pointed to his life as proof that one person, armed primarily with belief and integrity, can shape the spirit of a whole nation. He had begun as a quiet boy, listening to elders' stories in a small village, feeling the desert wind on his face. He had grown as a student in distant Jaghbab, absorbing knowledge with humility. He had walked as a teacher among his people, healing, guiding, reconciling. Then, when history demanded it, he had risen as a defender, carrying the weight of resistance without letting it harden his heart. He never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a servant of a trust, his land, his faith, his people. His life was not merely a chain of events. It was a continuous act of worship through action, in study, in teaching, in mediating conflicts, in leading men into danger, and finally, in accepting death with the serenity of one who knows that no sacrifice made for truth is ever wasted. His story became a folk tale, not because it was embellished with miracles, but because it was saturated with very human qualities taken to their highest nobility: patience, courage, humility, and unwavering conviction. Today, if one were to stand in the hills of Cyrenaica at dusk, when the sun sinks in a pool of gold and the sky turns the color of old embers, one might feel something of him still. In the silence after the wind falls quiet, it is easy to imagine the figure of an old man on horseback, moving slowly along the ridges, his gaze fixed on the land he loved. In the scattered stones and thorny shrubs, in the distant cries of birds returning to their nests, in the faint traces of forgotten paths, his memory lingers. The desert has erased his footprints, as it does for all who walk upon it. Yet the story of Omar Al-Mukhtar remains etched where neither time nor conquerors can reach it. In the hearts of those who dream of living with dignity, who believe that truth is worth standing for, even when the cost is great. His light has not dimmed. It glows still, guiding, comforting, inspiring, like a lantern carried through the vast, silent desert by the hand of a shepherd who refused to bow to darkness, and in refusing, taught countless others how to stand.